So if Dreher is correct, what does the Benedict option mean for Christian universities that have based their missions on the notion of preparing graduates to go out and change the world? Have we been wrong-headed about our educational task? What might this mean for how we do education in our institutions? That's what we're here to discuss this morning. So the first presenter will be Rod Dreher, who is the senior editor at the American Conservative. He has a number of books that have really interesting and provocative titles, such as Crunchy Cons, his first book, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, which I highly recommend to you, How Dante Saved My Life, and as I mentioned, the Benedict option will be out next spring. And then we have two respondents from Christian universities that would be the sorts of institutions that would be, I guess, right for candidates for creating these Benedictine sort of communities. The first is Matt Bonzo, who is professor of philosophy and director of the Institute for Christianity and Cultural Engagement at Cornerstone University. Matt has his bachelor's degree from Liberty University, although I don't know that he has endorsed Donald Trump as president. He has a master's degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam. Matt will be followed by Dr. Trisha Posey, who is the Associate Professor of History and Director of the Honor Scholars Program at John Brown University in Silent Springs, Arkansas. Trisha has a Master's in Philosophy from the University of Kent in Canterbury and a PhD in American History from the University of Maryland. So Rod will begin with an overview of the Benedict option and what that means for education, and then we'll have the two respondents. So please join me in welcoming Rod Dreher.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Last night, when I was in my hotel room, I looked online and saw that the town of Norcia, where St. Benedict was born and where there is today a monastery built over his home, was hit again by an earthquake, and the monastery there is uninhabitable now. The monastery where I went in February to visit with the monks there, most of them American, and to interview them about the rule of St. Benedict and how we Christians, not just Catholics, but all faithful, small o Orthodox Christians, can live faithful Christian lives in the post-Christian West. And one of the things people always say to me when they want to ask a question about the Benedict option is, well, aren't you saying that we have to withdraw, that we have to head for the hills and build the compound? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm talking about is what I saw with the monks there. I was talking to Brother Ignatius, a 6'2" Indonesian monk who was the guest master at Norcia. And he told me that so many of the men and women who come to Norcia to pray with him there in their basilica, a lot of them will stay around after they hear the monks chanting these ancient Gregorian chants, and they'll say, "That was so beautiful, tell us more about it." And this is for the monks who are cloistered for the most part, so they don't get a lot of chance to interact with the public, but that's a chance for them to start talking about Christ and what Christ means to them. As Benedictines, they are hospitable to the outside world, but they also have to be careful to have certain boundaries behind which they retreat for the sake of prayer. As Brother Ignatius put it, we can't be who Christ wants us to be for the world if we don't have these monastery walls within which to form our own consciences. So that's the general idea, how to take that out into the world as ordinary lay Christians who are called to live in the world. But how do we do that in an increasingly hostile post-Christian culture? What are the practices we need and the structures we need in our lives and the institutions we need to form ourselves as resilient Christian communities in this increasingly dark age? The Benedict option is the term I use to describe a decision that faces all small o Orthodox Christians in post-Christian America. Let me define my terms. By small o Orthodox Christian, I mean those believers, Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, who remain committed to the great tradition of Christianity, including and especially the authority of the Bible, in the face of modernity. I don't like the term conservative Christians because it has a political connotation that I don't think is helpful. But generally, when I'm talking about Orthodox Christians, I'm talking about people we would generally recognize as Christians who are theologically conservative within their particular traditions. By post-Christian America, I mean to pass judgment on the intellectual and cultural state of the United States today and the West in general. Christianity has ceased to be at the center of our national life. This is not a new thing, certainly, but it has now become completely undeniable, especially as the state is growing ever more hostile to any sort of orthodox expression of Christianity. Now, this would be tolerable, perhaps, post-Christian America if the state and the secular order would leave us alone, but of course it will not. There are still very many Christians, I find, laymen, clergy, even Christian academics, if you can believe it, who still believe that things are basically okay, that if we just continue on this path, we can hold on. After all, we can still go to church, can't we? I think they're whistling past the graveyard, and in their heart of hearts, they have to know that we are in dangerous new territory. Well, what do we small O Orthodox Christians do under these circumstances? Pope Benedict XVI said that the West is in the worst spiritual crisis since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. This is a judgment shared, I think, by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. I've been haunted a long time by MacIntyre's command to those who wish to uphold the virtues tradition to turn our back on what he calls the imperium and to form small countercultural communities within which the life of the virtues can be preserved through the present dark age. We await, he said, a new and doubtless quite different St. Benedict. Well, as many of you know, Benedict of Nursia was a pious young man studying in barbarian-ruled Rome. At some point around the year 500, he left the city, disgusted by the depravities and the chaos all around him, and went out to live in a cave in the woods, prayed for 3 years to seek God's will. When he came out, he founded religious communities, monastic communities, and eventually wrote the famous Rule of St. Benedict to govern them. He called the monastery in the Rule a school for the service of the Lord. Well, over the next few centuries, God took Benedict's mustard seed of faith and the Rule and used it to plant thousands of monasteries all over Europe. These monasteries served like arks of memory. The monks not only taught people how to pray, they also taught them the skills of civilization. They taught them metallurgy. They taught them how to plant again, how to build, how to craft things. And they kept within their libraries, their scriptoria, the precious text of Western civilization. The Benedictine monasteries prepared Europe for the rebirth of civilization. The debt that all of us today owe to those monks is incalculable. So what would a new and quite different St. Benedict look like in our day, in our own dark age? That's what my upcoming book on the Benedict option explores. I devote a chapter in the book to education, in part because my friend Michael Hanby, the Catholic philosopher, said that education has to be at the center of Christian renewal. He told me, quote, "Retaining the imagination necessary to see or to search for God is going to be an indispensable element in the preservation of true freedom and Christian freedom when our freedom under law becomes more and more limited." To compartmentalize education, separating it from the life of the church, is a false distinction. St. Benedict, in his Rule, as I said, called a monastery a school for the service of the Lord. That was no mere figure of speech. Benedict believed that discipleship was a matter of pedagogy, of training both the heart and the mind so that we can grow beyond spiritual infancy. In chapter 7 of the Rule of St. Benedict, in an instruction on humility, Benedict tells the brothers to remember that nothing is hidden from God, citing the psalmist's description of God as a searcher of hearts and minds. In the Benedictine tradition, learning is wholly integrated into a life of prayer and work. To be a faithful monk required one to be able to read, obviously, but the ability to write was also critical to the Benedictine life. Monasteries became places where countless monks undertook the painstaking work of copying by hand Holy Scripture, prayer books, patristic writings, and literature of the ancient world, classical world. These men of God laid the foundation for a new civilization, and they did it not because they wanted to save the West. They did it because they wanted to serve God, and that's what they knew they had to do. Today, our education system fills students' heads with facts, but rarely with any aspiration higher than worldly success. Since the high Middle Ages, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake has been slowly separated from the pursuit of Christian virtue. Today, the break is clean. The church historian Robert Louis Wilkin has said that there is nothing more needed right now than to shore up what remains of Christian culture, which has grown, he said, dangerously thin. In this, Christian colleges and universities play a critical role. It is a role that is threatened by two distinct forces today. One is the hollowing out of Christian commitment, the distinct Christian commitment from within, by what the sociologist Christian Smith has called moralistic therapeutic deism, this pseudo-Christianity. The other is the force of the state and big business, both of whom are forcing Christian colleges to give up their beliefs on human sexuality, in particular homosexuality. Christian colleges are going to face a tremendous struggle to maintain their accreditation in the face of the new anti-discrimination regime and access to federally funded student loans. This is coming, and if you don't see it coming, you're fooling yourself. Christian colleges are going to face also widespread stigma, such that certain major corporations will not wish to recruit on their campuses. Under this pressure, many colleges will capitulate. Others that do not capitulate will die. So what do we do? I don't want to be in the position of telling people to martyr their careers for the sake of principle, though I do want to say that if any of us as Christians are not prepared to do that ultimately, then we're not taking our Christianity seriously enough. All of us here in this room, I believe, are going to live to see a collapse of Christian higher education as we know it under these pressures. Even if you have a brave college administration and faculty willing to bear all kinds of pain to remain faithful, there's no guarantee that parents and students will have that courage. This is what it means to live in post-Christian America. A pastor I know in suburban Washington, D.C., told me that a couple came to him from his parish and said, Father, we need to talk to you about our daughter. She's in college and she wants to become a missionary. Pastor said, that's fantastic. Parent said, no, Father, you have to help us talk her out of ruining her life. This is what we're dealing with. And the pastor was telling me that, even though the people here in my congregation are faithful Christians who come to church, in the end, they want to be good Americans, which in Washington means climbing up the meritocracy. Well, let's assume for the sake of our discussion today that the professors in this room will remain at universities, both Christian and secular, that have burned that pinch of incense to Caesar. There may be good reasons to do so, though there will be no small number of rationalizations too. Anyway, what should we do? We should look to the example, I believe, of the Czech dissidents under communism. Within the circle around Václav Havel was one Christian, a Catholic named Václav Benda. He was a mathematician and a critic of his own church's response to communism. In the 1950s, the communist government broke the Czech Catholic Church. Its leaders fell silent, and many of its people became satisfied to stay quiet in public and just pray behind closed doors and not make a fuss. Benda rejected this. He understood that those who stood against the communist system, Christian or otherwise, were powerless to stop the government. But that did not relieve them of the duty to do something in the public square to bear witness to the truth, including the truth of Jesus Christ, and to strengthen their neighbors to do the same. Benda said that one of the reasons the system had such power over the people and demoralized them was it separated people, atomized them, made them feel that they couldn't trust anybody. He thought that one of the greatest acts of resistance that could be accomplished was to bring people together, give them any reason at all to get together and to know one another and to see what they have in common. He did this as a Catholic Christian, but he also did this as a liberal Democrat. Benda came up with an idea called the parallel polis, a shadow system of community that would exist alongside the structures of the state. In the parallel polis, Christians would live as Christians should, and that included not only teaching truths of the Christian faith, but also the heritage of the West and the Western humanities canon. So when professors would be fired from the universities for not following the Communist Party's line, Benda and his colleague would set up night schools to teach them real literature, real philosophy, and the like. They took all kinds of initiatives like this, not because they thought that one day they were going to overthrow communism, but simply because they wanted to serve God without fear, and that meant serving their neighbors too. Well, in our situation, I think this means that small O Orthodox Christian professors in the colleges are going to have to deeply engage themselves with the Orthodox Christian students on campus. Whether it's in Christian study centers like at the University of Virginia, or Christian housing, private housing like they also have at the University of Virginia, these small communities of committed Christian students who live together. Christian professors, or there's some other institutional form, Christian professors are going to have to make sure that the young people in their care learn about truth, goodness, and beauty. These professors are going to have to equip these students to be thoroughly countercultural in this, for the rest of their lives. This is not just a matter of acquiring knowledge, but also of acquiring habits, including a strong sense of asceticism to help them bear the suffering that is surely coming their way because of their commitment to Christ. Some of us will be called to start new colleges. My friend John Mark Reynolds down in Houston has started something called the St. Constantine School. It's a Christian elementary and secondary school based on the classical model. John Mark intends to add a 4-year liberal arts college to be part of the school eventually. He tells me that he's confident that the college bubble is going to pop for everybody sooner or later. He's trying to get ahead of it. The St. Constantine School will not offer sports programs or a lazy river or a fancy student center or any of the other gingerbread that colleges offer now. And there will be no chief diversity officers or bureaucrats to keep the imperium rolling. Just teachers, books, and students. And it will be affordable, and it will be authentically Christian, in part because they've tied it in its structure closely to the local church. Anticipating an accreditation crisis, John Mark is working now with lawyers and others to try to protect the school. John Mark tells me that he has plenty of job applications from PhDs, Christian PhDs from good schools, young Christian academics who don't want to submit to the PC regimes in the humanities as taught in most colleges. They love art, they love literature, they love ideas, and they love Jesus Christ. These new colleges have got to make places for them. These are the kind of initiatives that Christian educators are going to have to undertake in the Benedict option. Pope Benedict said that Christians in the post-Christian future will have to function as a creative minority within the broader culture. That time is now, and that time also affects the education system. One thing we have to get straight right now, though, the biggest problem we face is not the government, and it's not political correctness within the academy, though those are both huge problems. The biggest problem we face, in my view, is that Christians in this country, parents and their children, have been cut off from the basics of the Christian faith. They don't know what it means to live and think as faithful Christians. This is what it means, too, to live in modernity, to forget and to be forced to forget. In my travels around the country, in both Catholic and evangelical colleges, I hear the same lament from professors. These students we have come to us knowing next to nothing about Christianity. Even in conservative evangelical colleges, I've heard this. Their parents have failed them, these kids. Their local churches have failed them. College may be the last time they can be reached and shown the Christian truth. More and more Christian colleges have less and less to work with when it comes to their students. The challenge of forming Christian hearts and minds within the Christian college community is far greater and more difficult than it has ever been. This, too, is what it means to live in post-Christian America. Flannery O'Connor said that you have to push back against the world as hard as it pushes against you. My hope for Christian educators is that you will be the vanguard of an authentic Christian counter-revolution. We may not be able to hold on to our colleges and universities as true schools for the service of the Lord, but that does not mean that we have the right to abandon our educational responsibilities as teachers, as administrators, as parents who are the first educators of their children, and as believers. The barbarians, as McIntyre said, have been ruling us for some time, and the lack of the knowledge of this is part of our predicament. We've got to wake up. The culture war is over, and we're living under occupation. People within our own churches and communities are, so to speak, collaborating with the regime. Now is the time to join the resistance, to network with other believers, and to build up the local communities that will be able to be resilient and bear witness to Christ under all manner of persecution. It has been done before. We have so much freedom in this country now. Let's use it now to build these networks and build these relationships with each other, because we're definitely going to need each other in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. My response is entitled Practicing with Open Windows, which may be better than air conditioning. The Benedict option begins with the understanding that the culture wars are over and the recognition that the religious right has been discredited. Neither the political populism of the moral majority nor evangelical colleges' turn towards the world that coincided with the increased use of the term worldview resulted in the transformation or renewal of the broader culture. In spite of the hope that an authentic Christian education would not lead to just personal piety and sanctification, but could stem the tide of secularity, the culture wars were lost. Hunter confirmed many of our suspicions that we were losing in To Change the World, and confirmed it even more last night. But Rod, I'm going to refer to him as Rod because every time I hear the Benedict option mentioned, it's called Rod. But Rod issues us daily reports from the front lines with examples of how bad it may be. In one of his most recent posts, Rod dismisses as naive the thought that there's still a fight to be had, as if we could muster that one killer argument that could break through the battle lines that surround us. While war has its limits as a metaphor for describing the situation, I hear the Benedict option as a way of saying nuts when the Department of Education sends its terms of surrender. The story of how we got here is familiar and can be told in many ways. McIntyre's version of the story is that we've been headed down this path for a long time. Fragmentation of Western culture was bound to happen once modernity began to define morality on its own terms. The result that as we've modernity could never quite find an adequate foundation for the nature and end of humankind. The result is that we've become so morally fragmented that it's impossible for any framework to pull it all back together again. Humpty Dumpty is not going to be whole anytime soon. The result is that the predominant emotivism of our age turns moral discourse into a daytime talk show. The presidential campaign in which we are currently embroiled manifests this almost daily. Is there any question that no matter who wins, the country is going to be split between winners and losers with no vision on how to hold us together as a people? The wall's already been erected. The only thing left to recognize is who is on the outside looking in. And in no case will the outsider be either the corporate world of Trump or the political elites of Clinton. Charles Taylor's Secular Age tells the story of how we got here in a slightly different tone. As modernity took hold, people were presented with more options about how to imagine the world, as it is and as it should be. Religious options slowly began to lose their influence. Disbelief replaced belief as our natural state. The cultural power that Christianity once held in the West was diminished until it could no longer form us in the way it once did. To say that we've lost the culture wars is to say Orthodox Christianity has been pushed to the margins. By no means does this mean that individuals don't still believe, but its place in the public square is under negotiation at best. So we're left to deal with Christianity as it remains, the remains of Christianity. Has secularity killed Christianity in the West? Are we left wondering what to do with the ashes? Those who read the Benedict option as escapist or nostalgic hear Rod's call as a dirge. In the face of the coming legal and political challenges, we are to retreat behind the walls of our new monasteries. In spite of Rod's tone sometimes, I don't think the Benedict option is best understood as a withdrawal for withdrawal's sake. Rather, it's the intentional formation of a community where the practices of faith, hope, and love are emphasized. While I think it is true that there is no clear way forward at this point, virtues don't sustain themselves, nor are they an end unto themselves. The Christendom of the West may have run out of time, but the presence of Christ remains, abides, as witnessed to by his people. And to form communities that habituate people in the practice of faith, hope, and love, while they seek an answer to the question, is what the faithful way forward for the church in a secular age seems to be a hopeful act to me. The response to this suggestion, and it is the correct response, is, isn't this the role of the church already? And both Rod and Jamie Smith answer this the same way. The church is failing in its task to adequately prepare its people. So in giving his proposal the label of the Benedict option, Rod is choosing sides in MacIntyre's telling of the history of Western social order and ethics. Rod notes that in following MacIntyre's call for a different St. Benedict, he is not reducing the Christian vocation to join a community whose purpose is to wall itself off. In opting for Benedict, Rod is expressing his desire for a coherent community that embodies a teleology, as opposed to the radical autonomous individualism grounded in Nietzschean emotivism that was produced by the failure of the modern project. He desires this community because he sees it as essential to the practice of his faith. I take it that Rod's choice really isn't much of a choice. As far as I'm aware, Rod's never written an analysis of the pure logic of both Aristotle and Nietzsche and picked the rationally superior option. That may be your next bestseller. Such an approach is the very thing that MacIntyre's argument precludes. Rather, the choice has to do with which option best allows for and promotes the practice of a faithful Christianity to the current seismic cultural and political shifts taking place in Western liberal democracy, particularly in the U.S. The Benedict option purpose is neither escapist or fatalistic. Rather, it's a proposal for forming intentional Christian communities against a cultural backdrop that increasingly offers challenges. Perhaps it's more accurate to say threats to the faith. Maybe a shift back to Charles Taylor's description of the secular age is helpful in understanding the nature of these threats. In modernity, Taylor explains the world has become imaginable in ways that it had previously not been. We can now imagine a world without a God, a world without limits, a world with a morally autonomous self at the center. Seeing the world this way has led to many of our current political and cultural practices that Rod so often highlights in his writing. In living out of this new world, we see the establishing of new levels of autonomy and dismantling old limits so the emancipated self can remake the world in its image. And the impact of the liberal self is not purely political. Rod maintains that many of the current political shifts are now taking place have been generated by prior cultural changes. Political liberalism has, following Patrick Deneen's argument, reached its goal. Liberalism has so transformed the shared ideas and practices of the West that the social changes we are experiencing are simply the final steps to a self without limit, what Zygmunt Bauman calls the liquid self, a self utterly malleable to the whims of a consumeristic, globalizing corporate economy. Ironically, the coming liberating political changes will simply serve their master. Rod often notes at the American Conservative blog the way in which political and economic institutions are working hand in hand to confront an intolerant Christianity. There is no great conspiracy. There's no great Broderbund manipulating society towards its end. We lost the culture war before we knew there was a culture war, as political liberalism shaped its adherents to believe this is simply the way the world should be. Playing off Phyllis Tickle's insight, we can say that we're in the midst of a great emergence where all the boundaries we thought were fixed are now in flux. The very idea of stable communities, identities, or practices is dismissed as nostalgia for the old days. There is a more positive reading of Taylor's description of the secular age. In this reading, political liberalism is understood to be not quite so hostile to Christianity. Within the panoply of options, there remains a space for the practices of an Orthodox Christianity. The hope is that, as Jonathan Chaplin calls it, the hope is for a principled political pluralism, that it can take hold as a way to manage all the options as they continue or emerge. Within principled pluralism, Christianity no longer has a leading cultural role. Perhaps it has even been pushed to the margins. Christianity no longer carries a foundational identity for us politically or socially, and it certainly no longer is the central tradition from which our ideas and culture flow. But it remains an option. There's room for Hunter's faithful presence. And from those practicing communities, and from those practicing Christian communities, there remains the possibility of witness to those who recognize God is gone, but we miss him. This is the world that Jamie Smith stresses we must prepare for, not so much by getting our intellectual arguments aligned, but by addressing our desires and our imaginations, as well as our intellects, for the incarnating of a genuine option among the many options. Smith's understanding sees the possibility of a Christianity that remains both distinct from the surrounding culture and yet engaged with the culture. While there are important distinctions between the Benedict option and faithful present, I want to avoid pitting them against each other, especially under labels like the compromisers versus the fundamentalist. I find deep points of connection between the two approaches. I must admit that sometimes I'm caught between them, wondering which vision more accurately depicts the future. Depending on the day, I find myself leaning one way or the other. But I'm not sure we can't choose both. I hear Hunter, Smith, and Rod all saying that at this point in history, the need for the church and the Christian college to be a community that forms the character of its members, to resist the deformations of both radical autonomy and pervasive consumerism through the practices of faith, hope, and love, is as essential as ever. I'm not just going back to culture wars imagery in the next comment, but I think Daniel Bell's Just War as Christian Discipleship offers wisdom here. Bell argues that the precondition for having a discussion about whether a war is just or not is having the right kind of people to have the discussion. Maybe the key to be able to prophetically discern where our secular society is taking us and what our proper response should be is having the right kind of people. Loving, hopeful, faithful people. And here I think Dreher's Benedict option offers the university-wise insights. Without intentional practices, without a Benedictine type of order to follow, the character of our students and ourselves will continue to be shaped by the consumeristic forces that emancipate desire from any recognizable end. In a recent article in Comment Magazine, Derek Halverson noted that most of the CCCU schools bear greater resemblance to the liberal arts college than to any other historic type of academic institution. The liberal arts college, according to Halverson, harkens back to the model of higher education much older than the research university. That model has its roots in the medieval monastic schools. It would appear that the monastic practices are written deep in our identity as institutions, perhaps even coded into our DNA. Those monasteries produced not only insight into theology, but science, politics, and economics. Rod emphasizes the education in the Benedict option will need to produce people like John Paul II and Vaclav Benda, people who learned how to live faithfully while in exile. Living for the good of the city is no mere endorsement of empire's agenda. Israel continued to tell their own version of history, to sing their own songs in a foreign land. Like John Paul II and Benda, the Christian university will need to form members who can lament their losses and yearn for a home and live a hope that connects the two. But for the good of the city does also mean planting gardens and marrying. The Christian college will continue to need to form members who are able to offer humble wisdom in ways that address the sensibilities of our secular age. Discerning points of contact and opening in a diverse cultural context into which wisdom can speak is itself a learned practice. Not merely to play at labeling, but in addition to the Benedict option and the Jeremiah option, and the good of the city, maybe we need the Daniel option. You no doubt remember the story. Daniel was raised in exile, educated to serve the king, and was doing quite well until the force of Babylonian law came down on him through the manipulations of a few co-workers. Chapter 6 records Daniel's response to the edict that all people must pray only to Darius. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he'd done before. Daniel does not seem to be violating the charge given later in Matthew to go into your room and pray by his actions. He's not praying to be seen and praised for it. He's engaged in the practice of his faith behind the wall and in front of the window and willing to suffer the consequences. May our educational communities build strong enough walls to protect and encourage the practices of faith and form us as members who live in faith, hope, and love. But may our walls have windows and doors so that we offer the wisdom of living in faith, hope, and love to those watching. Whether we end up in the lion's den or the king's palace or both, only God knows. Thank you.
I think you'll probably notice some common themes between what Matt said and what I have to say. Mine will be in the context of my institution, John Brown University, which is in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. I must admit I'm conflicted about the Benedict option and its implications for Christian colleges and universities. When Dreher talks about constructing new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, and those are his words, when he rages against the wholesale acceptance of moral therapeutic deism by our young people and their parents, and when he talks about the need to, quote, construct local forms of community as loci of Christian resistance against what the empire represents, I want to shout amen like the good Baptist I used to be. And I'd like to believe that in ordering my own life, I've actually lived consistently with my beliefs about this. As an administrator at a Christian institution of higher education, I also see the value of the Benedict option in forming my students. And yet I hesitate to see this as a complete model for my institution and my teaching, for both practical and philosophical reasons. So what I'd like to do in my paper is offer a brief diagnosis of the state of Christian higher education today in light of its recent history, explore ways in which the Benedict option might help us think through some of the challenges we face, and then raise questions about the limits of the option for Christian colleges and universities. To understand why we're even considering the Benedict option at this time, and this will be familiar given what you've just heard, we need to look briefly at the recent history of Christian higher education. Coming out of the fundamentalist movement of the early to mid-20th century, Christian colleges and universities faced the challenge of reclaiming their heritage of Christian intellectualism. In the 1980s and 1990s, Christian scholars such as George Marsden and Mark Knoll, you guys know these names, dared evangelical Christians to embrace the life of the mind and to seek a seat at the table, so to speak, in places of academic power. Their work was not simply focused on transforming academia, however. They also believed that as leaders of the evangelical church, their high calling was to woo back the faithful to right belief and practice through the transformation of their minds. Over the years, a sort of tension developed between this outwardly focused seat-at-the-table approach and the inward transform the church approach. The reasons for this are complicated, but I would identify a couple of them. The first is that many of the Christians who took up the call to take their seat at the academic table actually discovered that they kind of liked their secular table mates and their ideas, and that Christianity was had a much richer tradition than they had been taught. As a result of these things, they grew frustrated with the very evangelical churches they were attempting to transform. Last week, I attended the biennial meeting of the Conference on Faith and History, and I know some of you were there, where our president, Jay Green, laid out the results of a survey he gave this past summer to younger members of the organization. One of the clear themes of the survey was that younger Christian scholars have largely abandoned the evangelical moniker, in large part because of their dismay with the ways evangelicals have behaved over the past 30 years. This is because while Christian leaders in the academy were doing this work, the evangelical church more broadly was also seeking cultural influence, but through the avenue of politics. The moral majority of the 1980s and early 1990s sought to bargain their way to power through participation in, even domination of, the political process. While Christian academicians sought authority through the strength of their ideas, Christians in politics sought power through the strength of the ballot box. And given the relative numbers in each group, maybe a few thousand in the academy compared to a few million in the broader church, the approach of the wider evangelical community was bound to dominate. And in the end, the church lost the culture war. I think the demise of books and cultures is evidence of this. The reasons for this are complicated, too complicated to explore here, but when we look at the current election cycle, it's patently obvious that Christianity has lost whatever influence it once had in American culture and society. As Dreher so rightly points out, this world is sick. Sick with the loss of ethically infused social roles, the rise and spread of the contract mentality that has come with the market economy, and the turn of religion toward that same marketplace mentality. All around us, we see family collapse, increases in drug and alcohol addiction, distorted views of sex and the body, incredible violence, incivility, the idolization of wealth, and a deep indifference to the suffering of the world. In this new era, Christian educators have to find a new way. And Dreher's Benedict option might help us forge a path forward through the tangled mess of our cultural and social crisis. Dreher defines the Benedict option this way. And these are his words. The Benedict option is about how to rightly order the practices in our Christian lives in light of tradition for the sake of intellectual and moral formation in the way of Christ, end quote. It's useful for us to think of the ways in which Dreher's vision of education in the historic tradition of Christianity and the development of shared liturgies and community might strengthen our institutions and our students for the work at hand. If we were to refocus our energies from influencing culture to pursuing the Benedict option, then one of the central tasks of our Christian institutions would be to develop ourselves and our students in sound doctrine and Christian history. I'm consistently dismayed, and Rod mentioned this, by my students' lack of knowledge in basic Christian doctrine. My colleagues in the Bible division talk about the common heresies that are peddled to our young people who have sold their faith for a mess of pottage. We need to take our moral therapeutic deists and turn them into young people who can appreciate the theological intricacies of Augustine, Calvin, and Aquinas, and who know how to approach Scripture with integrity. Teaching more church history is a fairly self-evident proposition to those of us who teach at Christian colleges and universities. At least I would hope so. But I think Dreher would have us go further. Orthodoxy must be matched by orthopraxy. We must develop students who not only understand doctrine, but who also live out the truths of that doctrine in their ethical and intellectual lives. This means helping our students understand the value of solitude, Sabbath keeping, charity, attentiveness, prayer, and community. These habits of being are completely counter to the messages our students are taught by the culture they've been steeped in their whole lives, which means that their education and spiritual practices must pervade every element of their experience on our campuses. And this is where things get difficult. There are both practical and ideological challenges to developing shared liturgies on our campuses. Practically speaking, crafting a common experience for our students that would mimic the communal worship of the monastery would require an enormous amount of coordination at our institutions, coupled with a deep commitment to a shared vision of moral formation. It would mean that every faculty and staff member and every student would need to agree to this objective for the educational process. We have a great deal of work to do as institutions to develop curricula, pedagogies, and co-curricular programs that reinforce these liturgies. At JBU, we have done our best in our honors program to create a strong curriculum that emphasizes spiritual formation among our students. I recently spoke with a senior in our integrated humanities class, and the teacher of that class is right here, Dr. Wilson. She said that all that talk about Aristotle and Telos that she was engaging was, and these are her words, kicking her butt as she was thinking about how to live her life. But we have our honors students for only 21 out of the 124 hours they take at JBU. And at times, our colleagues work at cross purposes with us. For example, one of the central themes of our honors experience is the importance of Sabbath keeping. However, it's difficult for my students to understand the value of Sabbath keeping when some of their professors offer study sessions for exams only on Sunday afternoons. Scholars like Jamie Smith and David Smith are giving us incredible tools for incorporating spiritual formation into our classrooms, but I'm afraid that few of us are actually picking up these tools and using them. Given the tuition-driven nature of my institution, there's little incentive for faculty and pre-professional programs to think about the spiritual formation of our students. That's because parents, again echoing what Rod said, tend to reflect the broader American church in that they show more interest in having their children get good jobs and pursue the American dream than they do in the formation of their children's character. For sure, they send their children to our institutions because they want them to receive a Christian education. But when I think about the questions I receive from parents, they're almost always about the jobs their children will have and the salaries they will make after they graduate. Because parents provide the majority of my institution's revenue, their interests, rather than the spiritual needs of students, drives to a certain extent the majors that are offered and the general education courses that are required. In addition to these practical challenges of developing liturgies for the purpose of spiritual formation, there are ideological ones as well. Dreher gives us the Benedict option as a member of a branch of Christianity that values highly the shared worship experience. And I think his presentation of Benda's Parallel Polis is beautiful, and I think it's consistent with that idea. But at my Protestant institution, where individual worship is cherished, such an option is a hard sell. Evangelical Christians value things like choice, mobility, and independence, and the Benedict option runs counter to these ideas. Our students are able to serve communion to themselves in chapel, for goodness sake. Having spoken with a colleague at a Baptist institution whose attempt at establishing morning prayer on his campus fell flat, just morning prayer, I can say that I'm not the only one who's experienced this. When our faculty and students actually experience the benefits of spiritual formation and true life and community, they're hooked. But for Protestant institutions, getting ourselves and our students to that place and sustaining us there is going to be a real challenge, although I do think it's a challenge we're taking up. The most obvious limit, of course, is that unlike monasteries whose members are committed to their institutions for life, we have students at our colleges and universities for only 4 years. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing. For obvious reasons and not so obvious reasons. One of the potential limits of the Benedict option is that in turning inward for the sake of the intellectual and spiritual formation of our students, we might be limiting our students' potential. I understand that the world they enter after they leave our institutions is a chaotic one, but the incarnational ethic we embrace as Christians, with Christ's own suffering and rejection as an example, reminds us that we are called to live and suffer with those who suffer. I guess what I'm saying is that I'd rather my students be martyrs than monks. As a Christian professor, I've been strongly influenced by Nicholas Wolterstorff's collection of essays, Educating for Shalom. Wolterstorff wrote many of these essays in his book at the time when Christian leaders were preaching the gospel of cultural influence through political power in the 1980s and 1990s. Rather than being taught to move up toward power, Wolterstorff argued college-age Christians needed to learn how to go down toward need. In doing so, they could serve as active agents in the promotion of human flourishing. As Wolterstorff says, quote, "A Christian university must do what it can to confront its members with the suffering of the world, partly to let us learn from the wisdom so often present in the voices of suffering, partly to evoke in us the empathy which is the deepest spring of ethical action, partly to remind us that an ethic that does not echo humanity's lament does not merit humanity's attention." End quote. In my opinion, this means that in our pursuit of the Benedict option, one of the central liturgies on all of our campuses should be that of lament. In his book, Prophetic Lament, Sung Chan Ra calls the church to lament as he reminds us of God's admonition to the exiles in Jeremiah 29, which we've already heard reference to seek the welfare of the city. He argues that in response to the rejection of the Christian ethos by the larger American culture, we should accept neither isolation nor capitulation. Instead, we, like the prophets of old, should cry out in lament, recognizing the death, decay, and destruction around us for what it is. And as those who embrace the incarnation, we should step fully into it. Instead of isolating our students in academic monasteries, we might also develop students who can create communities in which human flourishing can take place. This requires challenging and lamenting the assumptions about materialism, tolerance, individualism, and the nature of the human body that are pervasive in our culture. What are the implications for our curriculum and pedagogy? It means we have to introduce our students to the enduring questions of human existence through a strong liberal arts curriculum, as Dreher suggests. It also means that every class we teach, including the engineering classes on my campus, should respond to the normative assumptions of our culture and challenge them, if necessary. It means that we have to place before our students again and again the deep needs of those who suffer. In other words, our educational goal should ultimately lead to the development of students who are able to act as agents of shalom in a decaying world and even become martyrs in the pursuit of that shalom. So what does this look like in practice at JBU? Just to give one example, in my first year seminar class, Faithful Leaders in Times of Crisis, students learn about and practice spiritual disciplines while they learn about Christians who led during difficult times. The list of leaders includes Galileo, John Woolman, Sophie Scholl, Oscar Romero, Martin Luther King Jr., and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. For each leader, we look at a spiritual practice in which they engaged, we engage in the practice ourselves, and we identify the ways in which that spiritual practice shaped these leaders for the difficult work they faced. For example, we read Sophie Scholl's diaries and letters to learn how attentiveness became a means by which she saw God's work in the world, and then embraced her role in his work to rescue Germany from the Nazi menace, even though it meant the guillotine for her in the end. What's interesting about almost all of the leaders we examine is that they did die as martyrs. Their understanding of the need to enter fully into the suffering of creation was central to their countercultural existence as persons of faith in the world. By the time we finished the class, students have encountered multiple men and women whose deeply rooted faith bent the arc of history more closely toward justice. So in the end, what should Christian education be about? Not transforming culture, but developing Christians who live out the incarnate truth of self-abandonment, love for God and neighbor, appreciation for beauty, and movement toward the human telos of glorifying God and worshiping him forever. I think Dreher would agree with me on this. But I would go further and argue that precisely because we worship an incarnate God, we must teach our students to accept Wolterstorff's challenge, to walk from our campuses into the deep suffering of the world, even if, especially if, that suffering has been created by a corrupt culture that devalues humanity. As our secular peers embrace that devaluation in their curriculum and pedagogies, we can do better. Like the Benedictine monks who have given us such a strong example of faith during difficult times, we and our students can shine as a light in the darkness, both embracing and living out truth in the empire in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
and then pose a brief question if you have one. So I'll try to keep things moving along.
I'm Bill Jordan from Baylor University. In all three of your presentations, you kind of assumed that Christian higher education was liberal arts. And I don't see a huge amount that I could apply to my engineering courses. So you make a comment about Christian higher education that's broader than liberal arts.
I can answer that question. And I can answer it through an example that I heard when David Smith came to speak to our campus a couple of years ago. And the example that he gave was that, I think it was at Calvin in an engineering class. The students, as part of a project that they were working on, were required to identify who were going to, they were designing a car, and they had to identify who was going to benefit and who was going to suffer as a result of the making of this model of the car, and specifically with issues of safety. Because you could make a cheaper car that people can afford, but the trade-off is that that cheaper car is then less safe for people who can afford it, right? And so the prompt in this engineering class was to get students to think about the decisions that you make as an engineer are not morally neutral decisions. There are always consequences. And so I think having our students ask those questions in whatever field they're in, I would argue there's no morally neutral field, is a really important part of our task.
I agree with that, and one of the last chapters in the Benedict option book is about technology, and not simply about smartphones and things like that, but the technological mindset. The idea that seems to be unquestioned broadly in our culture that if we can do it, then we should do it, or at least that technology is nothing but more. It's only has to do with the moral intent of those who use it. I think that I agree with Trisha that should be contested, and part of the Christian liberal arts tradition is to teach technicians, those who are called to be engineers and scientists, to think that way. I have a friend, a young woman from Dallas, who grew up in the church I used to attend in Dallas. She's a brilliant young woman. She went to Johns Hopkins Medical School and got an internship at the NIH. She ended up resigning from that and to go into healthcare administration because she began to see that the kind of project she would be called to work on as a research scientist in medicine would violate her conscience. And that was, I was sorry that she wouldn't get to be a medical researcher. That was her dream. But she told me that, she goes, I just couldn't do it. I did not want to get so far down the road that I would have to blow up my career in order to do the right thing. I saw this coming now and said, I can't sacrifice my own principles. So that's the sort of thing. But that formation came, she was able to make that decision in a moment because she had grown up in a very thick Christian community. And that's, when I talk about the Benedict option, I talk about being those communities of formation so we can go out in the world, and when we're asked to be martyrs, then we have the courage to say, yes, I will, because we have made those decisions all along, and our communities have prepared us for that.
There's a question towards the back.
And if it's not context, which people, is there a project in terms of even a rearguard action? If you think liberal democracy is sliding into some kind of totalitarian dark age, is there not some value in, like I said, a rearguard action to preserve space for building these communities, to protect the least of these, whether it's an abortion, euthanasia, these kind of things? Is there not a political project in preserving, to the extent we can, the liberal democratic resources or the principle of pluralism, even, like I said, even if it's a rearguard action, to buy time to build up communities, to buy time for those who are going to be savaged by a culture that doesn't respect human dignity?
Oh, you're absolutely right about that, and I write about that in the book. I'm not calling on people to become political quietists. We have to fight with whatever we have left to fight with. But I remember last fall I went to Capitol Hill to give a talk at the Faith and Law group, and this was about 3 or 4 months after Obergefell, and I met with some key Christian staffers from everybody worked for Republicans on the Senate or the House side, and I said, so what do we do about religious liberty? Silence. Like, what do we do about religious liberty? Well, the message I got from them was, we in the Republican side are not planning to do anything because too easy for the media to tag us as bigots. We don't know it's not a priority for us. Plus, as we saw from the Indiana RFRA debacle, big business has definitely taken a side in the culture war. So I walked out of that meeting really discouraged, thinking we really are on our own here. That's not to say that we can't win some battles, as thank God California did what it did, but that's not going to be the last time something like that happens. I think that we need to take what opportunities we have now to build firewalls around institutions. That's the most important thing. If you talk to religious liberty activists, protecting Christian colleges and schools is the most important thing right now that they're looking at. And that's why I always vote, I used to always vote on abortion and issues like that. Now religious liberty has become the most important thing, because if we don't have the freedom to manage our own communities, then that's going to be the whole mission is much more difficult. So by all means, fight however we can, but what I want to try to do with this is make Christians, Catholics, Protestants, otherwise, understand that, we have lost this thing, that we're never going to have political influence like we once did. And in fact, our pursuit of political influence, in the way many of us have done it in the last 30 years, has dramatically hurt the mission of the church.
Go ahead.
Just real briefly on the California thing, because you mentioned this, and I think, Rick, you might know the story better than I do, because you were kind of, as head of CCCU programs, involved. But in California, what they did was, it was this close to being passed. And the presidents of the colleges and universities actually went to the Capitol building and talked to the people who had created the legislation and said, this is what you think we're doing, and this is what we're actually doing. And it was those conversations and busing in African American and Hispanic students, low-income students who would be greatly affected by the loss of their grants to go to these universities. That's what convinced them to change their minds. And so I think there is space for political action and for movement there.
Question in front of you.
I want to stand and make sure I've heard the back of the room. I'm one of those who have ears to hear and hear not. My question is addressed to the whole panel, but to Rod Dreher, if I may correctly pronounce his name. He's from the South. They don't have Germanic pronunciation. My question is about a throwaway line that Rod used about learning to practice asceticism. And it pertains to two, seems to me, dramatic problems at Baylor, and I think certainly other Christian campuses, not to say other secular campuses. And that is, on the one hand, the triumph of the smartphone. We're distracted from distraction by distraction, as T.S. Eliot says. The average Baylor co-ed spends 10 hours per day on her cell phone. The result is sustained concentration, reading, thinking, writing becomes extraordinarily difficult. What can we do to wean them off these demonic machines? FOMO, as it's called. And I'm very serious here. Their minds are being turned to mush. And it seems to me Christians have something to say about this. Andrew Sullivan and others are trying to get at this. So that's the first practical question. The second is that most of you know Baylor is under investigation by the Department of Education for Title IX violations. We had more reported last year than in the previous 5 years combined. But we need to remember that from what reports I'm getting, most of those violations were not alleged against athletes. Nor did most of those violations occur when men chased women down alleys, wrestled them to the ground, tore their clothes off, and raped them. They occurred in student apartments where everybody was naked already. She said no, and he would not stop. So the total sexualization of our culture, if we don't find some ascetic means for addressing that, it seems that along with the triumph of the smartphone, all of our brilliantly visionary ideals you three have set forth are null and void.
Well, and the two are connected. Yes. Scientists, I've seen this in Time magazine. Scientists now are studying the first generation that has been raised on the smartphone and which they use for pornography. And they found that it has changed the brains of these kids, this constant exposure to hardcore pornography. I got a in-your-face example of what the smartphone does and the parents yielding to it, letting their kids have it. Does when I moved back to my hometown in Louisiana, a town of 1,700 people on the Mayberry, we were homeschoolers. We moved from Philadelphia. My wife looked to see if there were other homeschoolers in the town. And she found this one couple, a Southern Baptist couple, and she asked the mom, why did you choose to do this? Because the local public school was one of the best in the state of Louisiana. And the mom said, well, when our 5th grade son came home from school one day and said, Mom, all my buddies are watching porn on their smartphones. Now, they weren't doing this at school. They couldn't have smartphones at school, but they were doing it. And that's when the mother and her father decided we can't let our boys be exposed to this. I find the fact that so many Christians just willingly accept this technology without any sense of any critical distance to be incredibly undermining of what we're trying to do. And not even if you never look at pornography. It's like Ralph and I were at a conference at the Clear Creek Abbey earlier this year in far eastern Oklahoma, so far out in the boonies that you can't even get a cell signal. And I noticed that whenever I would have a moment between conversations, my hand would instinctively reach for my phone. And it was shocking to me, because here I am, Mr. High and Mighty, about we mustn't let technology rule our lives, but I didn't even know what was happening. So I think that this has to start in the home, and it can't be simply a thou shalt not. We have to have a much more holistic education, a holistic asceticism. And it doesn't help, though, when a friend of mine at her Baptist church, the church has just put a new program in where you can sign up to receive text on your smartphone during the service. Scripture and scripture prompts, things like that. The normalization of this sort of thing is terrible. And it just amounts to something as simple. It's a very Benedictine thing, simple daily things like we won't let our kids have smartphones, and when they do have their little devices to play games on them, they're strictly limited because we don't want them to get habituated to the idea that this is how we live. And I think that, Ralph, what you were saying about the schools and the sexualization of schools, I think that returning to single-sex dorms may be a way to start this. But in the end, the culture is so sexualized, so eroticized, and so atomized that you're going to have to get Christians like the guys at UVA I talked to from from this house, this chance a lot. One of their rules is you cannot have women in your room, period. And they impose this on themselves. They weren't living with anybody. And it's going to have to require showing them the good of asceticism. It's not just for something bad. It's opening the door for something much better.
Yeah, man, Trisha, if you have any examples from your campuses.
Yeah, I was just dealing with the cell phone problem in class this week, in a large introductory class. And I feel, again, manipulative about doing this in a way. But I know students now like to receive points for anything, right? So I merely said, here's a table in the front of the class. I'm giving you 3 class points today if you'll put your cell phone up there. Everybody put their cell phone up there. Did it a second day, everybody put their cell phone up there. Third day, I didn't say anything, and there weren't any cell phones in class. Now, I know I'm going to have to go back and offer some incentive again to try to keep it going. But it was amazing how quickly, in some ways, you could begin to question the practice of just sitting there the whole time doing that.
Could I interject just a moment?
Yep.
There's a movement of Baylor afoot that we don't allow not only cell phones in classrooms, we do not allow tablets or any other kind of electronic device. Studies have been shown that students learn much less by trying to take notes on tablets than by listening, making marginal notes and the like. So that's a widespread movement at Baylor.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't allow cell phones or laptops or tablets in my class at all, and I take a punitive approach. If I see it, you get 15 points off your final grade, so that kind of helps with that. But I think I'm getting to your point. You know, in this first year honors seminar class where we have our students, it's the first semester of their freshman year, and they're being introduced to these spiritual practices. over and over again as they're experiencing solitude, as they're experiencing attentiveness, and we tell them you cannot do these things while you have your technology with you. They're starting to now think about what impact this is having on them in their spiritual lives. But it leads them inevitably to this point of lament, that, oh my goodness, I have been controlled by this thing and I haven't even realized. And it can be scary for them. And so what we have to do then is we have to take them to the point where we kind of bring them into the beauty of what life without these things looks like. And I think that's our job as educators.
Yeah, and this is where the Benedictine example can be really helpful, because the monks live in silence, a silence that none of us could live in or would live, or even called to live in, but they do this for the sake of contemplation. And what I realized a few years ago, my Orthodox priest gave me a prayer rule that required contemplative prayer for an hour a day. I thought it was going to drive me nuts. I could not focus. But after a while of forcing myself to do this, I was amazed by how much calmer I was on the inside and how I could tackle the spiritual issues that I was struggling with, because I had that still point to stand on. And it made me realize how much of my mind was just noise and how much of daily life is just noise. You go for a retreat at a monastery and you will discover the same thing about how much we crave that inner stillness, and how real connection with God and real putting together the fragmented pieces of our consciousness and our humanity is possible again only in silence.
There's a question toward the back, yes.
I did have a question. I'm referring to what you just said, and then the price of entry. I'm Brad Miller from Dunwoody College of Technology in Minneapolis, and I went to a Christian undergraduate college. I went to a Christian graduate school in Chicago, and now I'm finishing a doctorate at a Christian university in Minneapolis again, and I'm working at a secular 2-year college, which I love. But one of the reasons why I'm there is because they didn't require the PhD up front. I'm working on that now, and I'm wondering if one of the changes that we need to make is look for the type of people, the type of people we want teaching in places like this, and then invest in them to help reach certain credentials if necessary, rather than maybe the easier route of who's got the credentials, do they kind of fit with us? Okay, let's have you form these young minds, and how that relates to what you've been speaking about today for all three of you.
Yeah, it's interesting because at our university, I've been on a number of search committees when we've hired people, where the following conversation has taken place. Oh yeah, they don't know much about kind of faith integration, but they have a degree, and we'll take care of that faith integration when they get here. And that almost never works, right? So I wonder, I think you may be right, if it's not time in which you flip that around, maybe the more technical side in some ways can be added easier than vice versa.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
No, I agree.
Okay, let's go over to the right.
Forgive me if the question is not entirely coherent. I'm trying to link together comments y'all have made, things I've been thinking. So when we speak of people's malleability today, as if you could reshape yourself however you like and use electronics and to do that, it makes me think of the earlier question we had about engineering schools and what to do with them. So if we treat people as infinitely malleable, remakeable, repurposable, it seems to me that a more basic mistake that we've made in the modern period is to treat relationships between people as infinitely malleable, repurposable, or infinitely functional. And if we do that, then we also think of social institutions like universities or churches as infinitely repurposable, etc. And therein lies the problem. I don't think that the university can be infinitely remade or is even very loose in its construction, such that in its beginning, the university had the liberal arts with a few professional schools, which you could go to afterward, after the liberal arts. And it seems to me that it may be best that engineering or other professional schools are best conceived of as separate or after the liberal arts curriculum. And if we're gonna make that sort of thing happen, then we can't just take Baylor or John Brown or other places as they are. They're gonna have to go some basic reformation of finance, organizational principle, and they can't keep looking like corporate offices or state bureaucracies, because that's what they look like now. And even if we cut ourselves off from the feds or cut ourselves off from big corporate grants, we still have this internal formation that is like them. We have to get rid of that. So I welcome comments on that.
How radically reformed do the actual structures and process of our institutions need to be dealt with? I think that's kind of the question here. We want to at least take an initial stab at that question.
I definitely sympathize with that. I mean, it used to be that at these four-year institutions, the first 2 years were general education and education in the liberal arts, and then you get into your major in professional training. It kind of followed that model. But even at my institution now, I mean, from the moment the students are here, they're on that track in engineering, or they're on that track in business, or they're on that track in nursing, and it's like they have no time to stop and think. And so I agree with that, but it would require major surgery. And in my institution, I feel like we're moving in the opposite direction. And I don't know what to do about that.
I think the classical Christian education movement in high schools and down to elementary schools is a very, very hopeful sign for regenerating the inner person. I mean, it's amazing just listening to my little girl who's 10 years old, come home and talk about the things they discuss at their school. They're getting an awareness of the world and of the Western tradition in a Christian context, but it's being taught to them. They're talking about who is Machiavelli, and she's in 5th grade. She's not getting it at a high level, of course, but she's becoming aware of the world in a way that I never had growing up in public school. And the hope is that when she and our other kids graduate from this program and go off to college, they already will have such a love in their hearts for the humanities that wherever they go and whatever they do, it will already be there. That's the goal anyway. And it won't be something that they just discovered as soon as they get to college when they're half formed already.